You ever have that one thing that keeps you sane? For me, it was tinkering with old electronics. The soft hum of a soldering iron, the smell of dust burning off a circuit board. That was my therapy. Every night after work, I'd sneak into the garage, surrounded by half-dismantled radios, old tube TVs, and keyboards that clicked like rain on a tin roof. My wife, Emily, used to stand in the doorway with her laundry basket and shake her head. "It looks like a robot graveyard in here," she'd say. And I'd just smile and tell her, "It's not a graveyard, babe. It's a cathedral." But there was one problem. My cathedral had run out of space. I was constantly stepping over wires, balancing circuit boards on top of boxes, working on a half-square foot of table like a mad scientist trapped in his own lab. So one evening, I told Emily I was finally going to build a shed, a proper workshop out back where I could make a mess without turning our garage into a minefield. She laughed and said, "Sure, as long as it doesn't explode." That night, I went online, picked out the perfect little wooden shed, 10 by 12, clean lines, simple roof, nothing crazy. But before I could even finish my coffee the next morning, a letter showed up in the mail from the neighborhood association, the HOA. I didn't even have to open it to know who it was from. Our HOA president, a man named Richard Holbrook, was the kind of guy who probably alphabetized his cereal boxes. Always in a polo shirt tucked into khaki shorts. Always walking around with a clipboard like some suburban park ranger. The guy once fined my neighbor $50 because his lawn gnome violated the seasonal aesthetic. I wish I was kidding. The letter said, "Effective immediately, construction or installation of any new sheds, outbuildings, or storage structures is prohibited." I read that sentence 3 times. They had literally banned sheds. I hadn't even started mine yet. Emily leaned over my shoulder, read it, and whispered, "Oh no. Oh yes." That was the moment something inside me snapped. I know it sounds ridiculous. It's just a shed, right? But it wasn't. It was my space, my sanity. And this clipboard tyrant had just outlawed peace of mind. So I went to the next HOA meeting, ready to fight. The room was packed with my neighbors, all sitting in those cheap metal folding chairs that make you feel like you're in detention. Richard stood at the front, projecting slides of unsightly sheds and talking about preserving property values. When he finally opened the floor, I stood up and said, "So, let me get this straight. You're banning sheds because they're ugly? But that flamingo mailbox of yours doesn't count as visual pollution." A few people laughed. Richard didn't. He said, "Mr. Lawson, we have to maintain harmony." And I said, "Harmony? Richard, this neighborhood's about as harmonious as a middle school band recital." The vote passed anyway. I lost. But as I drove home that night, my brain wouldn't stop spinning. And that's when I found it, the loophole. The bylaw said, no permanent structures, which meant nothing about temporary ones. So I started looking at shipping containers. Big, heavy metal boxes. Technically not permanent. Technically not sheds. Technically legal. 2 weeks later, a 40-foot container showed up on a flatbed truck in front of my house. The driver, a guy named Gus who looked like he'd seen some things, squinted at my backyard and said, "You're kidding, right?" "Nope," I said, grinning. It took a crane, half the neighborhood watching, and about an hour of chaos. But when that massive steel beast landed in my backyard with a ground-shaking thud, it felt like victory. Richard, of course, came storming out of his house like he'd seen the gates of hell open. "What is that?" he shouted from across the lawn. I smiled and said, "A temporary storage unit, Richard. Look it up." For a moment, he was speechless. Then he turned red, muttered something about unacceptable, and stormed back inside. I'd won, or so I thought. The next morning, I stood at the kitchen window, staring at my glorious container. It was hideous, the color of industrial depression. Emily joined me and said, "It looks like a giant coffin for optimism." She was right. And then it hit me. If I couldn't hide it, I'd make it impossible to hate. So I told her, "We're gonna paint it." "Paint it what?" "A landscape. Like Bob Ross. Mountains, clouds, the whole deal." At first, she laughed. Then she realized I was serious. The next weekend, we went all in. We set up a ladder, pulled up Bob Ross videos on the laptop, and started painting happy little trees on 40 feet of corrugated steel. Neighbors started gathering, cheering us on. Even old Mrs. Haynes brought lemonade. By sunset, the whole thing looked like a preschool art project on steroids, but it was beautiful. and right across from Richard's backyard. The next morning, he saw it. I know he did because I was watching from my window like a creep. He came out in his robe, picked up his paper, looked up, and froze. His jaw dropped. The coffee mug slipped right out of his hand. It was the single greatest moment of my suburban life. But the war wasn't over. That week, the HOA started sending me fines, $100 a day for aesthetic violations. Every morning, another envelope. I started keeping them in a stack labeled fan mail. And for each fine, I mailed back a letter full of legal jargon and snark. Dear Mr. Holbrook, my happy little trees embody aesthetic harmony as defined by Section 7.4. The neighborhood took sides. Some folks thought I was nuts. Others called me a hero. They started calling my container the Freedom Box. Even the cops showed up once. Richard had called them, claiming I was running an illegal business. The officers took one look, burst out laughing, and told him to stop wasting their time. One of them even said, "Love the mountains, by the way." But the fines kept coming. Emily started worrying about the bills. That's when my old neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, a quiet man who'd lived there since the 70s, knocked on my door one night. He handed me a yellowed piece of paper. "You might want to read Article 5, Section 9, he said. It was the original subdivision charter, the one filed before the HOA even existed. It clearly stated that every homeowner was allowed one auxiliary structure up to 500 square feet for storage or hobby use. My container? 320. Perfectly legal. When the HOA tried to slap a lien on my house, I brought that document to the next meeting. The room was packed again. Richard was at the podium, ranting about community values, when I walked up and laid the paper on the table. Article 5, Section 9, I said. Filed with the county in 1978. The real rules. You've been enforcing fake ones. The room went silent. Then Jenkins stood up, voice steady as stone, and said, "He's right." Someone in the back yelled, "Vote him out," and that was that. The HOA turned on Richard faster than a pack of wolves smelling weakness. The motion passed. He resigned the next day. Now, months later, the Freedom Box still stands in my yard. The HOA lifted the shed ban. People built greenhouses, tiny workshops, even a chicken coop or two. My containers become kind of a local landmark. Folks drive by just to see the giant Bob Ross mural. We even host a little art fair every summer. Sometimes I catch Emily staring at it from the kitchen window, smiling. "You know," she says, "it's grown on me." And I tell her, "Harmony restored." Then she laughs and says, "Promise me next time you fight City Hall, you'll start smaller?" And I just grin and take a sip of my coffee. No promises. So yeah, that's the story of how one man's shed became a suburban revolution. Now I want to know what you think. Was I right to fight back, or did I take it too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, where's the line between standing up for yourself and becoming the chaos you swore to resist?